Welcome, Ben.
Thank you for having me.
I'll say a few things just before we get into it. Ben has a particular interest in Swedish and Nordic labor relations, which is why he's visiting Sweden and Denmark and Iceland at the moment. And together with colleagues at Harvard and elsewhere, he has been working on a project called the Clean Slate for Worker Power, which some of you may know about, which is partly inspired by the Nordic collective bargaining model and aims to develop a sectoral collective bargaining system or model, what we in Sweden call branschvisa avtal. So collective bargaining agreements that span across an industry, not just one workplace, right? To develop proposals about how this could be implemented or developed in the United States. The background to this is that, as all of you probably know, the American unions have a very limited presence in the US labor market. About 10% of the workforce is unionized in the US and covered by a collective bargaining agreement. Even fewer than that in the private sector, it's around 6%. Compared to Sweden, where around 70% of employees are members of unions and around 90% of the workforce is covered by collective bargaining agreements. And we will probably touch upon some of that today, but mainly we will discuss the upcoming presidential election. And I want to encourage all of you in the audience to ask questions toward the end of our conversation. And if you feel more comfortable asking in Swedish, that's perfectly fine. I can translate if necessary, or you can maybe try to guess. You don't understand any Swedish at all, right?
Hey.
Hey, yeah. So you can start with hey, and then I'll translate the rest. Okay, so before we get into the topic of today's conversation, could you just tell us a little bit about your own background before you came to Harvard?
Yeah.
And then say something about the Center for Labor and a Just Economy.
Sure, yeah, so thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you all about the U.S. system and the U.S. election, which is a source of intense anxiety for me right now. Not made better by the new poll in the New York Times this morning, but anyway.
What does that say? Sorry.
It's a national poll that has Harris and Trump tied.
All right.
And she's been up in their polls nationally previously. So the worrying thing is that it's showing movement in Trump's direction. But hope springs eternal. So I started as a lawyer at a little community-based organization that's called Make the Road by Walking in New York, which is I don't know if you have them in Sweden. It's a nonprofit organization that provides legal representation we work primarily with immigrant garment workers. And they were workers for whom a union would have been terrific, but there was no union to organize them. Yeah. And so we did sort of mobilizing and protest activity and legal representation for the workers in the absence of a union. I then went to the Service Employees International Union, where I was an associate general counsel for a number of years. That's one of the largest unions in the United States, both private and public sector members, represents janitors, security guards, home care workers, nursing home workers, and hospital workers. And after spending 4 years there, I decided to go back to academia and became a law professor for 2 years at Yale, and then for the last 17 years at Harvard, where I teach the labor law class and the employment law class. And I also have the privilege of being the faculty co-director of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy. The center is an academic center where we do collaborative research and policy design around issues of labor organizing and workers' rights. I mean, our mission is to think about ways and design ways that law can facilitate workers in their efforts to build countervailing power, power with which they can countervail the influence of the corporations and the wealthy. one of our major endeavors, as you mentioned, was the Clean Slate project, and that was a multi-year undertaking that involved hundreds of people from around the world. And the project was really our way of imagining a totally different system of labor law for the United States, one that would be designed explicitly to enable workers to build a more equitable politics and a more equitable economy. As you also alluded to, that is distinctly not the labor law that we have today in the United States. The labor law we have today is incredibly weak, terribly flawed, and one of the results of that weakness is the very low levels of union representation in the country. So about 6% of private sector workers have a union in the United States, even though more than 50% of the workers in the United States say they want a union. And that disconnect is largely attributable, in my view, to the broken system of labor law that we have.
How does that specifically work? What are the obstacles that the labor law creates for workers who want to unionize?
Yeah, so the system sets up workplaces as non-union by default, which means that unless workers take the affirmative step to organize a union and win a union election conducted by the National Labor Relations Board, there's no collective representation. So the default is no union. And it's then extremely difficult to win one of these union elections. It's really difficult to win them in large measure because employers oppose unionization and have at their disposal a wide range of tools, both legal and illegal, to block workers' organizing attempts. The most obvious tool is employers fire workers who try to organize unions in the United States. The best data we have suggests that 1 in 5 workers who takes a lead role in an organizing campaign is fired for doing that.
1 in 5.
1 in 5, and that, I mean, that number is significant in two ways. One, that means that 20% of union organizers lose their jobs, but it also means that for the other 80% of people who want to organize a union, they know that they're risking their jobs to do that, and the remedies that the law sets up are terribly weak and ineffectual. So for employers in the United States, it's economically rational to break the law and bust unions. Another aspect of the U.S. labor system, which is critical, and one of the reasons I'm so interested in Sweden, is that when workers organize a union, the only kind of union they can organize is a workplace-based union. So the broadest scope of collective bargaining that we have by law in the United States is the enterprise level. There's no right to bargain at the sectoral or industry level, and certainly not peak bargaining like you've had in Sweden. And I could go on and on. I'll mention one other thing. Workers have a binary choice under U.S. labor law, so they can either have no collective representation at all, or they can have an exclusive representative collective bargaining union. There's no provision for anything like a works council or in Denmark, cooperation committee. I think you call them union clubs here.
Union clubs,
yeah. So those are all illegal in the United States. So if you're a worker and you don't succeed in surmounting all the hurdles to getting an actual union, you get nothing at all.
Right. Yeah. And tell us about the hurdles. Let's say that we here, the workers or the employees here at Arena, we didn't have a union, and some of us said, let's try to organize. In the U.S., what would we have to do to pass all the sort of hurdles?
I mean, so the first thing you'd have to do is you'd have to get 30% of the workers to petition the NLRB for an election. So just to have the right to election, you need 30% of the workers to signal their support.
They have to sign like
a union card. Yeah.
Okay.
And as soon as the employer finds out that you're trying to organize a union, they'll bring everybody together in a room like this and tell you why you're crazy to have a union, why the company will go out of business if you form a union. They'll start threatening people. They'll start promising benefits to people who promise to vote no, and on and on.
Yeah. Okay, and let's say we manage to despite these union-busting tactics, we managed to get 30%
Yeah.
of the signatures. What will the next step be?
So then the labor agency will schedule an election, and there'll be a period of time between the scheduling of the election and the actual election date when managerial intervention will become more and more intense and more pointed, and discharges will become more and more likely. And the rate, the drop-off of union support between the filing of the petition and the holding of the election is marked, because the threats ramp up and so forth.
And in that election, half of the employees have to, or
50%
half of the
plus
voters.
one, half of the people who vote have to vote for the union.
Right.
Yeah.
And let's say they do.
Yeah.
What's the next step? What happens then?
So if a majority of the workers vote for the union, then there's a union, and then the union, then the employer has an obligation to bargain with the workers.
But they can stall that as well, right?
Right. So they have a legal obligation to bargain in good faith, but then just begins the next phase of managerial opposition and recalcitrance. And we've actually seen some high-profile examples of that in the States recently with Starbucks and Amazon. So there was no union at Starbucks and no union at Amazon forever. And we've had a sort of uptick in labor activism, and the result was the first successful Amazon warehouse union election. So the workers actually surmounted all these obstacles, voted for the union, and Amazon then just said, okay, and refused to bargain. And Starbucks is changing a little bit in recent months, but Starbucks has taken the same approach, which is just to refuse to bargain. And so then you have years and years of delay and litigation over lots of sort of picayune questions, and when management doesn't bargain.
Yeah, and in the case of Starbucks, that's been quite publicized here as well, that there's been a surge in organization in Starbucks coffee shops. But I think they have more than 17,000 coffee shops in the US. And each of these coffee shops has to go through the process you just described.
Yes.
So if after all the struggles and efforts, workers at one coffee shop like down here at the corner manage to organize, then they have 17 more thousand places to organize.
Yes, that's right.
Absolutely.
And there's something like, last I looked, 300 unionized coffee shops, Starbucks coffee shops in the United States.
300.
300, which
like
is
a lot.
A huge victory, and yet a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
And zero collective bargaining agreements.
Yeah. And here they would just, if Starbucks, and being a large employer here, they would, if they would be a member of the employer association that covers the restaurant sector, all their employees would automatically be covered by collective agreement, whether they're members or not of the union.
Yes.
So just to illustrate the huge differences in what it means to unionize in the US versus here.
And in the Clean Slate report, we have many recommendations, but one of the things we recommend is that in addition to enterprise level unionization and collective bargaining, and we have lots of recommendations designed to strengthen the prospects for successful unionization at the workplace level, because we think that's critical. But in addition to that, we recommend a system of sectoral bargaining.
Right. Okay, so just as a sort of backdrop to why these issues are important in the election. So moving to the topic of today. You mentioned that you felt kind of anxious about the election. The people you like, your friends and colleagues and people you hang out with and talk to in the US, what's the sentiment there in this election?
It's been shifting. I mean, I think that when Harris became the nominee, there was a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of optimism and energy in the labor movement and more broadly in the country. And it's kind of, it's a little bit been a downward drift since then as the polls have gotten tighter, and so I think there's a lot of anxiety. I mean, it's not over. You know, we still hope that she'll win, but people are quite anxious.
Yeah. And the presidential election isn't the only one. I mean, there are lots of state level elections, but there are also elections to the Senate and the House.
Yeah.
How important would you say that it is to win all the three branches that are at stake at the moment? And is it more important for certain issues?
Yeah. So we have a system of checks and balances where the different branches can stop the other branches from exercising unrestrained authority. The executive branch has special powers.
This is the presidency.
This is the president.
Right.
That the president can exercise even if the Senate or the House, the legislative branch, is held by the opposing party. So I guess to be really simplistic about it, in terms of exercising power in the United States, the most important branch is the executive branch. So if Trump wins re-election, there will be things that he can do, you know, to keep it to our subject, with respect to labor law and labor rights and workers' rights, without needing the approval of the legislative branch.
What could some of those things be, for instance?
So he'll be able to appoint members of the National Labor Relations Board, which is the administrative agency that interprets our labor statute and enforces our labor statute. So, you know, the extent to which management can do the things that I've described turns in some part on the way that the National Labor Relations Board interprets and enforces the statute.
Right.
And President Biden has appointed people to that agency who believe very deeply in union rights, and they've done, you know, they're limited in what they can do, but they've done good work in advancing workers' ability to form unions. I predict that President Trump would appoint very different kinds of people to that agency. Yeah. Right. You know, there's a chance that Trump wins the presidency and the Republicans win majorities in the Senate and the House. And they have a majority on the United States Supreme Court. So that would be a situation of unified government with Trump as president. And that would be a situation of almost unconstrained power. Yeah. So the Congress could, if they wanted to, change the labor law and make it even worse. They probably wouldn't need to, since it's pretty bad already. But yeah, I mean, if there's a scenario that's most worrying, it would be Trump wins the presidency and the Republicans gain control of the Senate and keep control of the House, because then there's no check on his authority. Yeah.
And the presidential election is really hard to predict. Obviously, it's a very tight race. Yeah. How does it look in the chambers of Congress?
Kind of the same. I mean, it looks really close in both the Senate and the House. There are a few incumbent Democratic senators who need to win and who are behind. Tester in Montana is an example. Sherrod Brown, who's a great champion of the labor movement in Ohio, is an incumbent Democrat and is facing a very tight race. There are some other races that are pointing in the other direction, so it's hard to know. But it's close. Yeah.
One of the fascinating things in this election, at least for me, is that both presidential candidates are presenting themselves as pro-worker and pro-union. So I'd like to talk a bit about that. If we start with the conservative side, I'd like to start in a perhaps, for you, not unexpected, but maybe for the audience, kind of unexpected place, which is a person named Orrin Cass and his think tank American Compass. Could you tell us about those?
Yeah, so just some political background or context in case it's helpful. You know, the U.S. has two parties, and for the last many decades, the Republican Party has been anti-union.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some exceptions, but the party as a whole is anti-union, and in large measure, sort of vigorously anti-union. The Democratic Party is largely pro-union, although kind of more moderately pro than the Republicans are anti.
Right.
In this election, there's been a little bit of a shift, at least in the rhetoric on the Republican side, in the direction of supporting workers and unions. One prominent place we saw this was at the Republican National Convention, every four-year political convention where the parties nominate their presidential and vice presidential candidates. The Republicans invited the president of the Teamsters Union to speak on the first night. And he did speak on the first night. And then that union, which is one of the largest private sector unions in the country, decided not to endorse Harris for president. They didn't endorse Trump, but they didn't endorse Harris either. Yeah. There are a number of senators, very, very conservative senators, including JD Vance, the vice presidential nominee, Josh Hawley, famous for raising his fist on January 6th, right. Marco Rubio from Florida, who have indicated a kind of support for not only for unions but for sectoral bargaining.
That's surprising,
which is very surprising. Yeah. The kind of the policy thinking behind this comes, as you say, from this think tank called American Compass, which is led by this young guy named Orrin Cass. The American Compass has taken the position that the Republican Party should support unions, but with a bunch of caveats. One, they shouldn't really support existing unions because existing unions are in the pocket of the Democratic Party, and unions shouldn't be political. Unions should just do economic bargaining. This is their position. And the reasoning behind the support for unions coming out of American Compass is very different than the reasoning that like Clean Slate advanced. So our motivation for labor law reform was building political and economic equality. For American Compass, the motivation seemed to be restoring traditional families. They write about the importance of equipping wage earners to support families on a single income as a reason to support unions, and a kind of anti-government motivation. So we should replace government intervention with union bargaining. But it is interesting, and it is a new trend on the political scene. I do want to, I think, separate out what the think tank believes, which I think is hard enough to parse out, from what the politicians believe. And it seems clear to me that that the Republicans are quite serious about wanting to attract the votes of working class Americans. They would love to have the support of the unions. They're very pleased that the Teamsters didn't endorse Harris. But they seem very unserious about actually supporting union rights or workers' rights to organize. So if you look at what Vance and Hawley and Rubio have done in the Senate, it's opposed the PRO Act, which is an actual pending piece of legislation that would make unionization easier. They're all opposed to it. They've opposed Biden's nominees to the National Labor Relations Board. They've tried to reverse progressive decisions of that administrative agency that would have helped unions. And then if you look at what the Republican Party is doing at the state level, the UAW, the United Auto Workers, has launched an organizing drive in the South, and a contingent of Southern Republican governors have joined the fight against the UAW's organizing campaign. They've joined it rhetorically, and they've joined it with legislation trying to interfere with union rights. So at the level of rhetoric, there is this move among some Republicans to support unions and workers. Yeah. But at least so far, at the level of actual policy and actual governing, they remain deeply anti-union.
Yeah. And what type of influence do you think that American Compass can really have? I mean, not only now, but maybe looking a couple of years ahead in the future, because they seem to be really influential, maybe not on Trump, but on JD Vance and people around him.
Yeah.
And I wrote an article maybe 3 years ago about American Compass, first time I've heard about it. It was sent out to you in the audience before the conversation. And I read some of the reports and I listened to interviews with Oren Cass, and what struck me was that well, for one thing, he seemed really knowledgeable, which maybe that's in your conscience and you can say something about that. But also he seemed, I mean, he knows what he's talking about, and some of the things he writes, I completely agree with. And I got the impression that he really means it. However, I mean, with the caveats that you said, that his interests are more in preserving the nuclear family and maybe keeping the government out and so forth. But if you look at actual policies, they resemble a lot of the things that the Clean Slate report also brings forward. So what are your views on that?
So I hear two things in your question. One is, what kind of influence is he likely to have? And two is, how genuine or real are his views about unions? I'll hold the influence for a moment.
And say why I just accuse you of.
Oh, he was my student. So I'm the one who taught him labor law. Yeah. Okay. So I think he's a very genuine person, and I think he believes what he says and writes. I think that there's some problems in his vision for labor law reform, and let me point to a couple. Clean Slate proposed that American workers who want to have a works council ought to be able to have a works council. But we did that as part of a system of labor law reform that would protect organizing rights, that would protect the rights to unions and collective bargaining, that would encourage sectoral bargaining, that would put workers on corporate boards, and so that works councils would be integrated into a broader system that would include really strong union power. Cass has promoted a bill that Rubio and others introduced that would reform U.S. labor law and just let workers have works councils. Now, if you have works councils without stronger unions, you have voice without power. Yeah. And that's a real problem. So does American Compass really believe in works councils? Yes. But without the support of a broader system of labor law reform, are works councils what workers need? I don't think so. Another issue I have with Cass's vision is Clean Slate started from the position that American labor law needs to be inclusive, that we need to bring more workers under the coverage of the labor statute, including workers who were left out of the statute in the 1930s for racist reasons, domestic workers and agricultural workers. We want to extend the statute's coverage to undocumented immigrant workers. The idea being that the way that the labor movement is strongest is when everybody is included and everybody is covered. American Compass is explicitly exclusionary. They want to tighten American labor markets by excluding immigrants. And they say this explicitly. This is not a secret. So that you improve things for, quote, American workers by keeping out non-American workers, namely immigrant workers. And that is not the vision of the American labor market or American society that we at the Center for Labor and a Just Economy have. The last thing I'll say, Cass seems to want sectoral bargaining instead of workplace bargaining. Another recipe for weakness, it seems to me. If you denigrate and decimate the workplace unions that we have and just try to impose a system of sectoral bargaining, it's not going to work.
Right.
So what we were proposing was strengthening workplace bargaining and adding a system of sectoral bargaining as a complement to it, as a partner to it. And so a very different vision than American Compass has. So I guess that's a long way of saying I think he's genuine, but I just think it's flawed, his vision for labor law reform. On the influence side, I think he's definitely influential. I mean, I don't think what drives American politics is ideas that come out of think tanks. No offense.
I'm not into American. I'm not in American policy.
Yeah.
So.
But I think the Republican Party is looking for a way of increasing support among U.S. labor unions. They're looking for a way to attract working class votes. And Cass is giving them a route to do that. And so, I think he's already influential. He already has the ear of the, potential vice president of the United States. And the New York Times seems to be obsessed with him.
Yeah.
And the Times ran a story with the headline, something like, "Can the Republican Party really be the party of the worker?" And it's Cass is quoted 5 times in that story. So he's got the ear of the media, he's got the ear of senators already, and if Trump wins, I think he'll be writing, U.S. labor policy.
I mean, to me, this doesn't sound entirely dissimilar from the Sweden Democrats' approach to unions in Sweden. I mean, I would say that the things you described apply to them as well. They also claim to be a workers' party. They claim to like the idea of unions, but they dislike existing unions.
Yeah.
They want to have, get unions out of politics, especially their connections to the Social Democrats, which is like equivalent of the Democrats' support from unions in the U.S. And they're also explicitly exclusionary. They also want to keep immigrants out of, they want to have, welfare state rights for everyone except immigrants.
Yeah.
So there are many similarities, I think, in the sort of arguments they make, which is interesting.
Yeah.
However, despite these sort of rhetoric expressions of support for unions, there have also been examples of the opposite. I mean, probably most of you have heard that when Donald Trump had a conversation with Elon Musk a few months ago, in August, he said, and I quote, although it's hard to quote Donald Trump, but I'll try. He said to Elon Musk, "You're the greatest cutter. I look at what you do. You walk in and say, 'You want to quit?' I won't mention the name of the company, but they go on strike and you say, 'That's okay, you're all gone.'" So he's sort of complimenting Elon Musk for firing people who want to organize.
Yeah.
And that's coming out of the mouth of a president who claims to be a friend of workers.
Yeah, I mean, so that got a lot of attention in the U.S. and among, you know, unions, and that conversation between Musk and Trump occurred very soon after the Republican convention,
Right.
At which Sean O'Brien spoke.
Sean O'Brien is the president of the Teamsters.
Yeah. And so, you know, nobody missed it.
No.
But, you know, there's just this weird feature of the current political landscape in the United States where Trump says lots and lots and lots and lots of things, and it doesn't seem to change anything. So, you know, I mean, Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, responded to that exchange by calling Trump a scab, and now wears T-shirts that says Trump's a scab. And so, you know, it's become part of the discourse, but it's a strange feature of our current situation that the head of the Republican Party can say something like that, and yet the Vance can still claim to be the you know, the voice of the working people.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move to the Democrats then. Kamala Harris has been pretty vague on policy so far. She's presented a few proposals, but overall she's kind of vague in trying to distance herself from Biden, but still not too much, still representing some type of similar policies. And we all know that Biden was openly pro-union, and he even walked a picket line, and he's always talked about how the unions build the middle class and the middle class built America and so forth. What can we expect from a Harris presidency if she wins in terms of labor policy?
I think she'd be terrific.
Not only better than Trump, but actually terrific.
Yeah. I mean, will the clean slate agenda be enacted under a Harris administration? Extremely unlikely. Yeah. But you know, will she support the PRO Act legislation? Absolutely, yes. Will she appoint people to the National Labor Relations Board who believe in unions? Absolutely, yes. You know, will she support workers who are on strike? Absolutely, yes. So you know, I have no worries about her administration from a labor policy perspective. Yeah. I mean, I think that the vagueness is, I mean, I'm not a political operative, but it seems unfortunate as a matter of campaign strategy. It seems like people have voters have reacted badly to her lack of specificity, not about labor law, but about a lot of things. At the end of the day, would she be a pro-union president? Definitely. Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's a big topic in itself, but could you say something about the PRO Act, what it is and what the prospects are for actually passing it, even if Harris wins?
Yeah, so if clean slate was like imagining a totally different system of labor law, the PRO Act is keeping our current system and making it better. Mm-hmm. So there's more protection for organizing. Employers would have less discretion to interfere with worker organizing campaigns, and I think we would see an increase in unionization rates in the United States. There's nothing like sectoral bargaining. There's nothing like allowing workers to have works councils, but it would make a series of smaller scale but significant improvements to the existing statute. It has no chance of passing.
Even if Harris wins and if both houses go to the Democrats? In like a utopian scenario?
You'd have to get around the filibuster.
And the Supreme Court? Or
there's not much of a problem with the Supreme Court on this law, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, you need a lot. You need significant support in the Senate, or you need to get rid of the filibuster.
And the filibuster makes it doesn't even go to vote.
You need 60 votes in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that would mean they have to win 10 more seats.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Right, let's talk about unions then.
Okay.
You mentioned that the Teamsters haven't endorsed any candidate. I don't know if you want to speculate as to why. So one thing could be like, actually, I find it hard to think that they can't decide on whose policy is best. But I've seen a report that they made a poll among their own members that could maybe explain this.
Yeah.
Could you say something about that?
The Teamsters said that they did an internal poll of their members and that a majority supported Trump.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I know, they haven't been terribly transparent about the methodology of the poll. But I think it's probably true that a significant percentage of the Teamster membership, just like a significant percentage of a lot of union membership, supports Trump. O'Brien relied on that in his decision not to endorse Harris. The Teamsters did allow local chapters, local unions, to make their own endorsements.
Mm-hmm.
And many Teamsters locals went ahead and endorsed Harris and are doing the important work of getting out the vote on her behalf. And all of the other major unions have endorsed Harris. We'll see if it's enough.
Yeah. And are there other unions that are more like not only endorsing Harris, but like actively supporting her and very like
many of them, yes, with financially and with very sophisticated get out the vote programs,
mm-hmm.
To educate voters and also get them to the polls on election day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned that this surge in interest for unions, like the fact that most workers, or a large majority of workers at least, say that they would join a union if they could. So we see like a growing interest and positive attitudes toward unions, and actual organizing is also happening at larger scale than before. But as you mentioned, labor law and strong counteraction from employers have sort of held that back. It hasn't translated into higher union density. Is that all? Can't we expect any results from all this growing interest and organizing efforts? Is it impossible to overcome the current institutions?
I would never say it's impossible, because then I couldn't get out of bed. I've been inspired and impressed by the courage of workers across the country at places like Amazon, Starbucks, Apple, Chipotle, places that we never thought would unionize. Graduate students in the United States are organizing in unprecedented numbers. So there is energy, and there is a kind of heroic will to overcome the barriers. The clearest thing I can say is it shouldn't be this hard.
Yeah.
It shouldn't take a hero to form a union.
Mm.
It should be like the most sort of commonplace democratic right that somebody exercises.
Yeah.
And that's not true. You have to be a hero in the United States to form a union. Now, there are heroes. And we also know that when it comes to union organizing, success breeds success. And so, to the extent that Starbucks workers continue to win, maybe that will breed more organizing success.
Yeah, like a snowballing effect.
Yeah. But it shouldn't be this hard.
No.
Yeah.
You wrote an essay recently, a co-authored an essay in the Columbia Law Review with the title "The Chicken and Egg of Law and Organizing." why did you write it, and what's the core argument of the
Yeah, so my scholarship has focused in recent years on the question of how law can be shaped to facilitate organizing. How can we use law and law reform to make it easier for working people to organize? And most of it has focused on labor, but I've actually done some work on other forms of organizing, like tenant organizing, debtor organizing, student organizing. How can law be used to facilitate organizing by poor and working class people? And if we keep it to labor law, you can see that there's what we call a chicken and egg problem, which is if you need labor law reform to facilitate organizing, right? If we need to change the law to make it possible for workers to form unions, but you need the social movement power, the political power of unions to do the law reform, to get labor law enacted, to get over the hurdles in the Senate. You've got a chicken and egg problem, because you need the law to facilitate the union growth, but you need the union growth to facilitate the law reform. So the essay was designed to sort of highlight that question and then look at some history and propose some solutions. So how do you break the chicken and egg cycle?
How do you break it?
So we pointed to three possibilities. One was in some ways the most obvious and the least common, and that is disruption. So in the 1930s, we had major labor law reform in the United States, and that was a product of a massive strike wave. In the 1960s, we had civil rights reform in the United States, and that was the product of massive unrest through the civil rights movement. So, one possibility is that before we get the PRO Act or before we get clean slate, we'll need another strike wave that looks like the 1930s.
Right.
The other two, they're more mundane, but they're in some ways more conceivable. One is shifting jurisdictions. So in the United States, we have the federal government, but also state and city governments. And the idea is if you can't get something done at the federal level, try at the state or city level first, and use the power that you build at the state and city level ultimately to translate back up to federal reform. And the final was shifting jurisdictions, not shifting branches of government. So if you can't get something done in the legislature, try through the presidency and through executive action. That, of course, depends on the political alignment of the branches, but those were the ideas. Right. And just so I give people a reason to be optimistic, there are different jurisdictions in the United States. The federal jurisdiction is, in some ways the most powerful and in some ways the most important, but it's not the only one. We have 50 state governments and hundreds of city governments. They all have lawmaking authority, and many states are what we call trifecta democratic states. So where the state government, the state executive, the governor, and the state legislature, both the state Senate and the state House are all controlled by Democrats. And they're experimenting with new ways of doing labor law. And so, whatever happens on Tuesday, a week from Tuesday in Washington, there will still be reason to be optimistic about California and New York and Massachusetts and states like that.
Right. I'd like to end with a question relating to Sweden. I've written a few articles on Labor blog that you host, that you edit, about the Tesla strike. So I know you are somewhat familiar with it. Can you say something about what your impressions are and how you view it from the U.S. perspective?
Yeah, so an example of kind of the power and influence and anxiety caused by Elon Musk in multiple corners of the world. this is a little narrower of a reaction, but I'm so deeply impressed by your protection for secondary activity. What you don't call it secondary activity.
Sympathy strikes, so sympathy action,
right.
Or sympathy strikes. Yeah.
Right. So in the United States,
or solidarity strikes.
right.
Sometimes.
In the United States, not only do unions lack protection for secondary sympathy, solidarity strikes, those strikes are illegal.
Yeah.
And can be enjoined by courts. And so when I see what unions have the right to do here, it's just another reason that I'm inspired by Sweden.
Great final words. Thank you so much, Ben, for
Thank you.
talking with us. And thank all of you.